Welcome back to part two of this week's lecture on copyright and permissions. Picking up where we left off with fair use. So here's another exemption that libraries and cultural heritage organizations have to use material in a digitized form. So libraries and archives have the right to preserve materials regardless of copyright status that is written into US copyright law. That provision explicitly allows libraries and archives to make up to 3 copies of a work for preservation purposes. And these items can be preserved in any format, text, images, sound, etc. And the copies can be digital as long as they are not distributed digitally or made available to the public in a digital format outside the premises of a library or archives. And this is just for materials that are in copyright. So in other words, you have the right to digitize an in-copyright work as long as you don't put it online or make it available outside your library or archives without the permission of a copyright holder. So one way to get around concerns that you might have about a piece of digitized material that you think might be in copyright, you can just make it available on site rather than put it online in the wider internet searching ecosystem. This, however, brings me to the issue of risk. So there certainly can be financial or reputational risks for libraries, museums, and archives around copyright issues, but they're incredibly rare. And when those risks do arise, they're almost always resolved through discussion rather than litigation. So again, with the caveat that I'm not a copyright lawyer, I'm not saying don't worry about putting copyrighted materials online, but I am saying there are steps you can take to reduce the potential risk. And if issues do come up, you can probably work through them without getting sued into oblivion. So let's say you have an orphan photo. You don't know who the copyright holder is. You have made your very best effort to find out information about who the copyright holder would be. You can't find it, and you make the decision to put that photo online. You know it's based on a date that it's in copyright, but you don't know who the photographer is or anything else about it. So what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, if the copyright holder finds out that the photo is online, they can send you what's known as a takedown request or a copyright infringement notice. This in itself is very rare, and it's not as scary as it might sound. But if you do hear from a copyright holder with a valid request to remove an item, your best course of action is to just take the item down. If you ignore the request or say no, that's when you potentially open the door to legal action. But you can avoid the legal action by just taking the item down. If your institution chooses to make orphan works available online, there are some practices you can adopt to minimize that risk. Really, these are good practices for any materials you put online, whether they're orphan or not. And they're basically all about being transparent about your decisions. So the big one is to clearly indicate the copyright status of any items that you put online, whether this is in copyright for sure. We don't know if this is in copyright. We've done our best to find out and we can't figure it out. This is out of copyright. This is in copyright, but we think we have the rights to put it online because of fair use. So in your readings, you'll see there's a great resource called rightstatements.org, and they have a set of standardized language statements you can use for this. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when you write metadata for your items and you include a standardized right statement. Other best practices can include making sure to attribute the creator or copyright holder if you know it, and adding some language to your website or online collection to describe what it is you'll do if you receive a copyright infringement notice. If you Google takedown policy, you'll find all kinds of examples from this in other libraries and archives, and I included one in your readings for this week also. So circling all the way back to the beginning of the first lecture where I was talking about the importance of noticing culturally sensitive materials. There are a whole host of considerations for permission that don't have anything to do with copyright that should factor into your decision to share materials online. This could be an entire conference session or an entire conference all on its own, so this is not in depth, But read the section on the Digital Readiness Toolkit in this, follow the links to the readings, and do plenty of your own research on this too. But I'm going to share this list here as food for thought. Regardless of their copyright status, some red flags to be aware of might be any materials that contain personally identifiable information, materials that might violate a community's cultural protocols, or materials that violate an individual's right to privacy, particularly for protected or vulnerable populations. Please feel free to ask me any questions that you might have about this. I talk and work in this area quite a bit, so I'd be happy to talk through anything with you. The question might naturally arise then, what if I do have some of those materials, those culturally sensitive or other types of materials? There are a couple of options available, but first and foremost, if you can at all consult the people or communities who are depicted or who might have an interest in the digitization project, you should do that first. Get in touch with those people. If you don't already have a relationship with these communities, this is a good opportunity to begin building one. Some options you might have are you could make the item available only on site, as we talked about earlier, which lets you control access a little bit more and control what's done with the images. You could blur the item online either until it's clicked or blur it entirely, but still provide the descriptive information that requires a user to request an unblurred version. You could not digitize it at all, but still include the metadata online for finding and searching. In some cases, you might find that the community members depicted in the materials would not only like you to not digitize them, but perhaps they'd like the physical items back. And although this is a sensitive situation that certainly should be addressed on a case-by-case basis, I'm going to advise that you err on the side of doing just that when requested. That if, let's say, an Indigenous community has asked for materials back, I would recommend finding a way to make that happen. If we have materials that depicted historical or Indigenous figures and the local tribal community wants those images returned physically or digitally, my first choice is always going to be to abide by the wishes of the community. Now, this is a huge topic that's not easy to navigate that there's so much consideration that goes into this. But for the purposes of this course, I mostly want you to know that it's a real issue that librarians and archivists actually deal with when digitizing all the time. Okay, that's most of the information that I want to share with you in the lecture. I want to give you a couple of notes on this week's assignment. There's a few things that appear in this chapter of the toolkit that I want to specify you don't need to do for the assignment, but you can if you would like some feedback on them. In the toolkit specifically, there's a bunch of information and some samples on things like deeds of gift and donation forms. These are really useful and you should feel free to use them in your own institution. But for the purposes of this week's assignment, you don't need to generate those. Again, you'll just know where to go looking for templates if you need them. You might want to consider at this point, although you don't have to tell me, how you would go about documenting permissions in your organization or for your collection. You also don't need to write a full content statement at this point for the assignment. Again, the toolkit gives you examples, but you'll just need to know where to find those in the future. For now, just think through which materials you think might benefit from something like a harmful content statement. That's it for this week. As always, keep in touch and let me know how it's going.